I am an archetypal thinker, essentially. I've been thinking in and through and around and about archetypes for the last 46 years. The way I have made the archetypes visible to me and in my work has been as an archetypal astrologer for the same amount of time, since I was 16 years old. I've also done a whole lot of consulting and coaching using the same model, the archetypal model. And about 7 years ago, I partnered with a friend of mine. We've been doing personal development work for, oh gosh, a couple of decades together. He does leadership development out of London, Richard Olivier, based on Shakespeare. His father, of course, is Laurence Olivier. He's been doing leadership development globally for a long time, and we've been doing this work with my astrology together in personal development workshops. And one day we just decided, you know what, this needs to be put together. And we started creating this model called Archetypes at Work, which is a model to essentially bring the archetypal thinking into organizational corporate settings. So now we have a full system. We've written a book, we have a model, we are teaching tons of students in 3 cohorts this year, 3 full cohorts. It's 106 hours of training. So we're creating a community of practice of people who go out and actually use this archetypal work in the world in a very practical way, bringing soul back to business, bringing meaning back to people's professions, helping groups communicate better and develop a language to solve problems and so forth. So we are now working in large companies around the world, some companies with 180,000 employees, so really big global organizations doing this work around archetypes. So my passion and my work has been around archetypes forever. I still have a practice as an archetypal astrologer. I still do that. And I'm also running the Guild, which is this essentially an entity to hold these practitioners of the archetypes work in the world.
Wonderful. Now, you mentioned archetypes a couple of times, and there's a long tradition in our philosophical heritage of contemplating what archetypes could be. And I'm curious if you would be so kind and define your own perspective and version as to what archetypes mean today.
Archetypes are essentially universal principles or universal ideas. Plato called them ideas that are universally understood. So I think of, let's take an archetype, for instance, the archetype of mother, universal archetype. So everyone has an experience of mother. It doesn't matter who you are, where you are, how you look, how tall you are, what your skin color is, or what any other criteria that we usually like to separate people into, are. Everybody has an experience of mother. If your mother dies in childbirth, it's a different experience than somebody who has a very doting mother till they're 60 years old. So we have different experiences, but everyone experiences. The archetype is the mother. We then translate that through personal experiences, through personality, through all kinds of different experiences to the actual experience of mother in the world. But the archetype is recognizing the underlying pattern that's going on. So the archetype of mother includes things like nurturing or not nurturing, the bosom, embrace, chicken soup, the hearth, the home, the family, roots, ancestry. Go back as far as you want with those ideas. It's all encompassed in that one archetype of mother and mothering. Each culture does it differently, each person does it differently, but what we teach and what is interesting for me with archetypes is to develop what's called an archetypal eye, which is then the ability to see in those words that I just gave you, the common denominator, which would be the mother archetype. That's what they all share.
You mentioned earlier the desire to bring meaning and soul. Where did we lose meaning? Where did we lose soul? How did that process happen? And why is it so important to bring meaning and soul back into our daily lives?
Well, let's just start with that. I think we are meaning-making creatures. I think it is part of the gift of humans. I don't know if any other creatures, animals, plants, anything else that's alive makes meaning, but I sure know that human beings are meaning-making creatures. We ask the question, why? Why is this happening? There's a lovely quote by paraphrased by Nietzsche, which is, we can take any what if we know why. So people are asking why all the time. And why is this happening to me? Why is this going on in the world? Why is the world falling apart? Why are things different than when they were, and so on? So I like to give answers to that question. That's part of what I'm interested in. And the archetypal model gives a why. So if I'm angry all the time, I can rather than just describing the behavior, I can go at the archetype that might be underlying that and say my warrior is hyperactive. Why is my warrior hyperactive? That's then an interesting question we can work with developmentally. But to get to the point that it is the archetype that is acting up as a language to understand what's beneath the behavior of being angry all the time could be very useful for a person, as we found. So that would be my answer to that part. As far as the, when did we go awry and when did we lose soul? I don't know if we can, put a date on that. But I certainly think that the Industrial Revolution brought a whole lot of mechanizing and making machines out of people, where essentially the idea was that people are part, and a lot of leaders still think that way, that people are just part of the machine that makes the widget. And so, I need 25 machines and I need 16 people to make this widget. And the people can be replaced. And if somebody doesn't cooperate, then we kick them out and find a better piece of the whole machine. And that's an old model that I think is falling apart. I think in the new world, that model no longer works. I think the new generation, your generation that's coming in, thinks very differently, doesn't want to be a cog in the wheel, doesn't want to be just a number on the assembly line, but wants purpose and meaning and what I would call bringing soul back to the conversation. So that's what I mean with putting soul back into organizations, or bringing soul back into organizations, is helping people make meaning of why are they doing this. There's a very popular book out, start with the why. Why am I doing what I'm doing? Why am I going to work every day? People are asking these questions. That was never asked by, if you go back 2 generations, nobody asked that question. You went to make a living, and you went to support your family, and you went to because everyone was going to defend the country. You went to war and these kind of things. It wasn't asked the why. You just did what you were told and what was the right thing to do at that time. People are asking why today. We talk about that, that the archetypes are what are running the show anyway, so you might as well get in touch with them. And I have a saying that's kind of based on kind of the old Greek model of the gods, being within us and around us. And that saying is, you do the gods or the gods do you. And what I mean with that, you could say you do the archetypes or the archetypes do you. It means that these parts of us will be heard, but mostly they're unconscious and they just act out. And so we just don't really know what's going on. It's like, being puppets in a way to these archetypes. And most people who are unconscious live that way. I just get angry. I don't think about that Mars might be getting activated and what that might mean for me. Or that my dreamer is there too often and I always daydream and I never get anything finished, or whatever the story is that, that I do. These are inner parts that we all recognize. We are naturally thinkers, that we are multiple inside, that we have multiple inner characters. We have conversations with ourselves. You can't do that if it's a singular entity. So we're conversing with ourselves. We're having parts speaking. We play a multiplicity of roles during the day. We act differently when we're talking to our loved ones and when we talk to our employees or to our bosses and so on. So we know this very naturally, how we step into different roles. And we're giving this a model that we can work with and develop then parts that are not performing the way we would like, because we're paying a price for that. So for instance, if my warrior is not well developed, then people walk all over me and I can never defend myself. And if my warrior is overdeveloped, then I yell at people all day long. So there's that middle zone, that optimal zone where the warrior is a great gift to us. And that's how we work with all of the 10 archetypes that we work with.
I'm getting a sense of our inner complexity, part of us as a unity, as a whole, but there are also distinct characters in our inner mythic play, so to say.
Right, and that's the archetypal model, whereas the developmental model traditionally has always been a singular identity develops. I am this, and then I develop into this stage and this stage. If you look at any of the well-known developmental models, they assume a singular I, a singular identity. So I was this, and now I'm this, I'm in this stage or whatever. It's also always hierarchical, and up here is better and down here is less worth. It's an old model that I think has run its course. Our model says there's actually 10 parts of you, 10 inner archetypes, which is just like keys on a keyboard. They can make any melody, right? So we have that based on the tradition that it comes from. But we have these 10 archetypes. With them, you can play any melody, right? Just like with the piano, you can play any melody with those 12 notes. Lovely analogy. And with the piano, and we use the metaphor of a stage. Both Richard and I come from a sort of using theater in a non-theatrical context. I've used theater as a metaphor for my astrology for decades, and he, of course, does leadership development based on Shakespeare and stage. He's a director, a stage director. And so the theater director. So in his background. So we both use this theatrical model in the archetypes at work as well, where we say you have these different characters, the ones that you have well developed and that you've been supported for all your life, and culture has told you, and you're nurturing, your family has told you and everything, that those are ones to develop. You've developed very well. And you have those center stage. Those are your lead characters. You always show up with those, right? And because you've been rewarded for those. And then there's others that you're not so, that are supporting actors. And then there's those who are what we call more offstage actors, parts of yourself that you have never or very rarely have access to, don't really like or don't really know about. And that could be cultural. And that gets into things like, boys don't cry and girls don't get angry, those kind of stereotypes culturally allow those parts of us. Whereas what happens to the warrior who can get angry in a woman if she's told all the time that girls don't get angry? So what happens to a boy or a young man who is told, boys don't cry, and what happens to that person culturally and over time, what happens to their dreamer or their nurture or those inner feminine sides that are more imaginative, for instance. So, and when I say feminine, we have to be careful because that's a very loaded word. I mean, right brain is an easier way to talk about it. So we're talking about right brain capabilities and left brain capabilities, really, is how I like to think about it.
What was your original spark to become aware of the archetypal nature? And perhaps it happened before you had the term archetype in your language.
That's a very good question. A couple of things. Well, first of all, of course, my father is the founder of, or the founding voice. He likes to think of it as the founding voice of archetypal psychology. So as a friend of mine once said, you were marinated in archetypes, as a kid. That's probably true. I went to a Waldorf school called a Steiner school. I grew up in Switzerland. And, very imaginative, lots of fairy tales, Greek mythology, music, art, crafting. I learned how to knit. I still play the recorder really well. So a lot of creative, imaginative, right brain education. Not so good on the left brain stuff, but really good on the right brain stuff, theater, drama, dancing, movement, all of that. And then when I was 16, I was kind of a bored teenager. I then moved into a sort of a more regular school with much more left brain activities. I was kind of bored. And my mother, who was very interested in astrology, suggested I go study astrology. And I'm like, whatever, I was a bored teenager. So we had a family friend who I'd known since I was a little boy who used to come and stay with us. I called him Uncle. And he was, living in the same city. And she said, why'd you go study astrology with him? He was a professional astrologer. I'm like, okay, whatever, So I went on my little moped and I went up down the hill where we lived and visited him. And I sat with him and he said, so you want to study astrology? I'm like, I guess, and then I remember like it was yesterday, 10 minutes into my first lesson, I'm like, this is what I'm going to do all my life. Boom. It was just like, it was probably, if you believe in past lives, was probably something that I had experienced previously. It was extremely familiar to me, extremely easy to understand. And I never looked back, and that's now 46 years ago. So it really was a moment of insight. And my second thought right after it was that I'm going to do it full time when I turn 40. And before then, I'm going to do a bunch of other things. That was always what I sort of knew. I ended up doing it full time when I turned 38. And before that, I did a lot of other things. But yeah, that was the spark. That was the awakening. The first book that I wrote in, over 20 years ago was about life purpose, which is essentially where I got my sense of life purpose, was at that moment where it was like, okay, I get it. And in there, I write about 3 different ways that we can have these awakenings or these moments of recognizing. The first one is through calamities and accidents and things like that. There are no accidents. And sometimes something majorly happens with a tragedy, something horrible, and they sort of wake up. This is about what I call waking up. Like, wait a minute, what am I doing? And I'm on a routine. And when you get shocked out of it somehow, sometimes it's an accident or an unexpected event, or somebody leaves you, or somebody dies, or something happens. It just wakes people up to, it's like shock therapy. It's like, whoa, okay, I get it. I'm on a path that is, as Joseph Campbell said, I'm climbing someone else's ladder, and this is not really what I want to be doing, or what I should be doing, how I should be focusing my life. That's one way. Another way is through dreams. That's a really good, that we have visions and dreams and repeated dreams, of nightmares or happy dreams or something that it keeps telling us. Our subconscious kept saying, hello, pay attention, And the third way for me is astrology. That's what I do. My specialty is life calling. After I had that experience, I made it my specialty to help people find out what is their thing, why are they here? And that's not a job description necessarily. Your life calling is a lesson that you came here to learn. That's the most important thing for you to sort of take along. In my mind, it is the thing that when we lie on our deathbed and think back on our lives, it's going to be that thing which really matters the most. Did we do that? How well did we explore that area of our life? And that can be relationships. It can be creativity. It can be a career. It can be money. It can be different things where we have to learn about a particular lesson. And there's a system around this. It's not just random words. There's a model that goes around that idea, but it's a very powerful tool that I have focused my practice on for the last, decades, many decades, to help people find that sense of purpose. And it gives a direction. It gives a sense of, to have that experience. So to me, those are the 3 ways, either calamity, a dream, or an astrological consultation of somebody who specializes in that. My father wrote that New York Times bestseller called Soul's Code, where he talks about the similar issue of how do we find that sense of that moment of awakening, like, wow, this is what I'm here to do. And there's some great stories in there. And it's not always a simple moment. Not everybody has those moments, and it's not fair, because I feel very lucky that I had that clarity at 16. A lot of people end up in their 60s still having no clue of what they want to do and where their calling is. So not everybody gets that. Some people do, and some people don't. We have to grow into something. Remember the story of the bullfighter. When you was 5 years old and is terrified, is going to become the greatest bullfighter in the world. Imagine being 5 years old and your soul already knows that. That's terrifying. So he clings to his mother's skirts until he grows into it. So we have to grow into our calling. And so I believe in universal timing. I believe that each soul unfolds in its own way, in its own specific personal way. There are no formulas. There's no timetable. Some people find their calling, late in life. Some people wake up and find it, when they're very young. There's no judgment. The key is understanding, not judgment, or not categorizing and putting people in boxes and saying this is the proper way. It's a fluid. The soul is a very fluid thing, which is again why I have a problem with most classical developmental models, because they're not very fluid. And people also change. We don't, we do this and we do that, and we develop differently. And so sometimes we work on this part of ourselves, then on that part, then we meet another new person, and that person helps us develop that part of ourselves, and so on. So it's a much more fluid and yet a developmental model that we do learn new things over time. I believe in universal timing, and I've been working around timing and time all my life. And I believe that things happen just exactly at the right time. I've had people call me up and say, I really need to get in. I really need to have an appointment right away. And then, I try to get them in, I get them an appointment, and then they cancel. And they do that for 6 months. They keep calling in, they have to get in right away, they keep canceling. It goes on and on and on. When they come in after 6 months, it's the exact perfect time for them to get there. So I never get upset if somebody doesn't show up for something that they want to show up to because they're not ready. I believe things happen exactly. I believe that the universe is perfect. I believe that things happen exactly when they need to happen. It's a very Oriental philosophy that the universe is perfect. There are no mistakes. There are no accidents. There are things that are really horrible. Of course, a lot of really horrible things. But in context, even those horrible things, if understood, we can take the what if we know the why. And, this archetypal thinking gives you a why to the what, and then it's tolerable, even the stuff that we don't like or don't want to accept or find horrible and evil and whatever else we call them. I've also gotten feedback from students over the years that they're really happy that I'm an optimist because it's so refreshing, especially in the last 20 years or 25 years. There's so much pessimism, and I'm an eternal optimist. Doesn't mean I'm blind or naive or puer in that sense. But I am very aware that that negative thinking and sort of getting ourselves down and only looking at the glass half empty is cyclical, and feeds on itself. And that's not very healthy either. So there's some way to be realistic about what we can do about, and to also be responsible for the energy that we put out into the world, because that does duplicate as well. If you put out positive, optimistic energy, then that will happen. So yes, I use that in class. I use a lot of what I call Jupiterian, or which is the planet that belongs to it, or jovial, which is the archetype that goes with it, or the explorer, positive, funny, humor, new ideas, taking people to the edge of where they're comfortable and just doing that kind of stuff. Absolutely. But mostly it is trusting that I do very little preparation when I teach, because I trust that if I've tried to be very, very prepared. It's the same thing when I do a reading. I think good teaching is when you are connecting with source, you're downloading, right? It's not really just, you're not conveying information. It's not about, the old model of teaching is opening up your head, putting a funnel in it, and then pouring it full of information that you can spit back at me in an exam, right? That's the old model of teaching. I think that's very outdated as well. And I think the new model of teaching, or a new model of teaching, is one where we trust that we have done our homework and that we know what we're talking about. We know a subject well, and we trust that the moment will bring in the information that we're going to convey, but that really the job of the teacher to me is about lighting a fire, getting people excited about whatever. It might just be as simple as getting them excited about life again in a world that is very, very life denying. And so how fun is that if we can just get people to recognize that they can tap into their source, whatever that is for them, and be filled again and have fun again and connect again and be optimistic again and see a future, then I think that's a good thing. That's, to me, what teaching is about. It's about activating something in people that they have access to. It's not about filling them with information. So what is the process that I have to do to get you to start to do something else? You can find information anywhere now. That's not hard. It's the process of how to activate your abilities to access the information, or to play with information, or to co-create with information, or create something on your own, or these kind of things. That's what a teacher does in my mind. Is that it's not that I have all this knowledge that I'm going to convey to you, but that I know a few things about. Let's say I think of it as walking with you on a path. And let's say we're studying botany. And so I happen to know a whole bunch of things about plants, and I'm going to point them out to you. And you can go over if you want and smell them and touch them and rub them and see what the oil feels like. And you can do all of that if you want. I can show you some things and point that out to you. So it's an experience. And because I've done that many times, and I've touched those plants and smelled those plants many times, I can show you what I know. And then you can have the experience yourself. And that to me is good teaching. And we're walking next to each other. It's not that I'm above you or better than you, or I've just done a few things a couple of times. And so I share with you what I have experienced, and you can take with that what you want. It's a little bit like throwing out seeds. You choose to keep them and grow them. That's up to you. But I think that's what a teacher does. We're not responsible for growing the seeds. We're responsible for handing them out. When somebody awakens, anybody who's ever raised a kid knows that when that kid suddenly, when there's that aha moment, that is delightful, and that's age unlimited. It's just harder for us to do that when we're older because, you know, we're not supposed to or whatever. But when that aha moment happens, when somebody gets it, when I was teaching at Meridian last fall, some of the answers, some of the things that people realized about themselves through the work that we were doing together was just incredibly rewarding. And to me, that's like, yeah, that's what it's about. That's why we teach. That's why a teacher hopefully is in the classroom, because it is these moments where the coin drops and the person just like, you know, turns on, switches on and gets it. And you get that in the responses, you get that in the reactions, in the what it triggers for them, what they associate. My definition of intelligence is being able to learn something over here and apply it over there. So when they learn something over here and they apply it over there in their new thing, that to me is an intelligent response that's just such fun. And it's great fun to see the candle start burning in someone's head. You know, that's really, or in their heart. That's extremely fun. So I've been very fortunate to have a lot of feedback that, you know, people have made associations with their own lives, that it's been useful for them, it's been practical, it's been applicable, it's been recognizable, the work that we do together. And that to me is, that's the gift, that's the value for them and as much for me. On why I've been doing what I do for 46 years, because I get almost weekly, I get some kind of a reminder that this is worth doing. Somebody writing me an email and saying, you know, this changed my life. I can finally understand this, or you've given me a perspective I've never thought about. That is, you know, there's an old idea, I think it's a Talmudic idea, that if we change one, you know, if we change one person's life, life has been worth it. As in, you know, we give them something that's life-changing. And to have that experience again and again, I think as a teacher, you have, and I also think with the archetypal work that I do, I know that I have, because I get the direct feedback from people all the time. That's why I do what I do. I wouldn't do it otherwise. So I'm requesting meaning in my own work for myself, or I couldn't be teaching that or asking people to find that for them. The world is indeed global now. You know, everything is global. We can't think any smaller than that anymore. It's not possible on any level. I was teaching a class this morning and there were 12 people in the class from 5 countries. You know, that's extraordinary, you know, from all over the place, different time zones. And it's just so exciting to me that people are showing up from very different backgrounds, different cultures, to speak a common language, the language of humanity, which to me is the archetypal language. That's why in the beginning you started to talk about, you know, the relevance of the work to today and why now. And I think if I can just jump there for a minute, if that's okay. We live in a world of tremendous separation. Othering is the name of the game, right? Everybody is like, I'm not like you, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm black, I'm white, and whatever the separations are, it's about othering. And people want to sit in their corner and say, I'm not like you. So I was very actively looking for a language that is uniting as opposed to othering. And you know, I work with people in organizations, and most organizations use assessments, you know, to define, you know, to find out who they have working there. And so the very popular ones like Myers-Briggs and all these assessments that are out there, there's hundreds of them out there, are all personality. Just about all of them are personality type assessments. So you become a type. Well, in a type by definition is an othering model, because if there's 16 types, I'll make it real simple. In the Myers-Briggs, I know there's subtypes and blah, 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 and introvert, extrovert, all of that. Forget that, just the 16 types. That idea that I am an INTFJ, for instance, and I'm therefore not the other 15 types, has just separated me from that group. It gets worse, because then people say, well, all the INTFJs should be in accounting and all the, you know, whatever should be in sales. And so that kind of thinking is horrible. And the new generation, your generation, is refusing to be labeled like that, or to be labeled in any way. Think about the gender conversation. You know, don't label me as this or that. You know, we're beyond a binary in-group, out-group, with me, against me. That no longer works in the new world. So we need a language that can unite us rather than separate us. And so the archetypal language goes from a completely different model. It says, guess what? We all have the same 10 archetypes. Like I said in the beginning, I don't care what you look like, where you live, how tall you are, how old you are. None of that matters because we just have 10 archetypes. It starts a completely different conversation. Now I can say, Richard, tell me about in your culture, in your background, where you grew up, in your home, how was the warrior handled? Because I know there's a warrior in you. And I'll tell you about how the warrior was handling my life. And now we have a conversation going, but we recognize the similarity. It's a universal language. Archetypes are a universal language because everybody in the world, no matter where you go, we've done this work with yam farmers in Africa and all over the place. And you find it doesn't matter where you go, people understand these archetypes immediately because they translate them into their own cultural backgrounds. And now you start to learn something interesting about them through the similarity. So it's a language of connection rather than a language of separation. That's really important. So we have an assessment that also, because companies want assessment. So we developed an assessment, but it's an archetypal assessment. And it doesn't type you. It says, here's how you live the 10 versus here's how that person lives the 10. Now, what does that do in the group and how does that relate to each other? You have a group of 10, you have their 10 assessments. What's missing in the group? What's really strong in the group? What archetypes are popular, which are not so popular? That starts to open up all kinds of conversations about similarity rather than difference. There are times to be consistent. If you're doing the books for your business and you're doing numbers or you're doing your taxes or stuff like that, there's times to be consistent and to be organized and to be square and to be like, there's times for that. The key is to recognize that there's times for different things. Different archetypes show up at different times, and they're doing it anyway. So we might as well become aware of it and interact with what's already going on. The greatest question I learned from my father to ask is to ask the question, who is there? Who is here? Who is here in a given moment? And that's just asking and wondering which archetype is present. And it doesn't matter what language you use. If you use our language with the archetypes, or use astrology, or you use another archetypal model, it doesn't matter. It's about asking what the archetype is that is underlying the current moment, situation, expression, thought, whatever it is. It's constantly there everywhere. When you develop an archetypal eye, I have a lecture I did called Venus in a Chocolate Mousse, which essentially says, that's where, to me, because I have, I think like that all the time. It's like I'm wearing archetypal glasses all day long. So when the waiter puts a chocolate mousse in front of me, I see Venus in that right away. I see the archetype of Venus, the beauty, the deliciousness, the seduction, the chocolate, the texture, the whole thing to me is Venusian or lover archetype. So it's a way of thinking. It's very useful because it explains the world.
Maybe you can just close by stating, where does your optimism come from? Where do you see it? Where can you feel it in the world today?
Well, first I'll give you an archetypal answer. I have a very strong inner explorer. The explorer is the optimist in the archetypal pantheon. And mine is very strong by nature, but also by nurture, I think, because that's just how what I saw in the world. But I'm particularly excited about the future because what I see, through all these cracks and through all the failings, there's many images out there that, it is through the cracks that the light comes in and all those ideas. So I'm looking at what is emerging, and what is emerging is an archetypal awareness. People are starting to speak this language. The ease with which we are teaching this model and this language to people around the world, the ease with which people are grasping this way of thinking, the ease with which someone from your generation is able to talk. You're obviously super intelligent, but even so, even people who are not that intelligent can grasp the concept and can grasp the ideas that are going on and are asking for something else. Astrology is more popular today in your generation than ever before, really. It's insane to me that, and it's a longing for meaning making. There's a hunger out there for meaning making in the new generation. I'm very optimistic. I have a daughter who's 29, and she's, there's a hunger and an excitement for positive change that can happen that I'm recognizing in younger people. Sure, I can see that's my cat called Shadow. I'm recognizing, of course I can see, I don't have my head in the clouds. Of course I can read the news and I can understand and I can recognize all the horrible stuff that's happening. But it doesn't respond to anything by doing that. It's just creating anxiety and fear within me. So what I have done is developed my optimistic side by looking for the good stuff that's happening. And one of the good things that's happening is the awareness in the new generation that is longing and hungry for meaning. And you don't find meaning in the older models. It just doesn't give it to you. And so they're looking outside of those old models. They're looking outside of religion. They're looking outside of the traditional capitalist model. They're looking outside of all these structures that we've put on ourselves as human beings over the last, many millennia. And there's something new happening that I find extraordinary. In astrology, we have a language for it. It's called the Age of Aquarius. And, I have a lecture on that I just did 2 weeks ago about what I call being future fit for the Age of Aquarius. What does it mean to become ready for that? Because if you're not future fit for a new age, then you literally fall by the wayside. You become obsolete. You become that worker who isn't skilled in technology. And nobody wants you or nobody needs you because you can't run a robot. And that's that being outdated means that. So instead of saying, well, you're not fit for the future, because this model says we all have all 10, I specifically talk about that archetype that we need to develop, which is the renegade, to be able to speak in the future, to the future, and with the future. And that's the part of us that we all have. But some people, for lots of different reasons, have repressed it, or the culture has repressed it, or their partner has repressed it, or for whatever reason, we don't activate that part of us. It's the renegade. I sometimes call it the third finger part of you, that says, don't tell me what to do. I'm going to do whatever I want. That renegade part is the one that speaks future. And we need to activate that part. That's what I talk about in that lecture, and we can. And there's ways to actually do that practically. That's the activation of a certain part that's already existent in all of us. That model allows us to do that. Other models say, guess what? You're an introvert, you're never going to survive. Goodbye. Because everybody's showing themselves on the internet, you're not going to do well and you're going to suffer. We're going to look back and say, boy, it's like pulling teeth. People were so slow in understanding and awakening. And why were they so, didn't they just get it? It's like people, I think, are going to evolve to think faster, quicker, sharper, differently, much more intellectual, which doesn't mean that you lose soul or that you lose, it's just that we have this sense of soul that it has to be slow and that it has to be deep and it has to be these things, which it is on its way. But doing one doesn't mean you exclude the other, because we have them all. That's the whole point. But so I think people are going to look back and say, boy, were people slow. Back then in getting what's happening. And boy, do people not make the larger connections of what is happening. And I think that's the great gift, that we can make those connections now. We can see how things are actually connected in a much larger sense. The famous butterfly effect, that everything is connected, and the global thinking, which I said earlier, is the key to everything today. We can't separate ourselves from anybody or anything, not even from matter for that matter. There is no distinction between us and ideas and dreams and energy. We're learning all that now slowly, the spiritualistic people have been saying that for millennia, and they're rolling their eyes. Oh, finally science is catching up.